My son sold their family home and let his wife, my daughter-in-law, waste $620,000 of the money. When it was all gone, they showed up at my front door, demanding to live in my house. I told them no. So she slapped me across the face in my own front yard, in front of God and all my neighbors. That was the moment she learned a very hard lesson. You don't back a 64-year-old woman into a corner. That very same day, I called my lawyer, and when the subpoena finally arrived, she completely panicked. I'm so glad you're here to listen to my story. Please follow it to the end because I promise you the ending is worth it. Before we dive in, I'd love to see how far my story has reached. Comment below with the city or country you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. It would mean the world to me. Now let me take you back to the beginning. It all started on a beautiful Tuesday morning in October. The air in Cleveland, Ohio, had that perfect autumn crispness, the kind that feels clean in your lungs, and the sun was casting long golden shadows across my well-tended lawn. At 64, my greatest joys were simple ones, and my garden was chief among them. My late husband Robert and I had poured 30 years of our lives, our sweat, and our love into our modest two-story home on a quiet tree-lined street. It was paid off, a fortress of memories and peace, and it was all mine. I was on my knees in the soft earth, my hands covered in dirt, tending to my late-blooming roses, the very same bushes Robert had planted for me on our 25th anniversary. Their scent was the scent of my life, a mix of sweetness and resilience. In that garden, surrounded by the ghosts of a happy marriage, everything felt right with the world. My son Mark was the center of that world, especially after Robert passed 5 years ago. He is a good man, truly. He has his father's hard-working nature and a kind, soft heart that sometimes bordered on naive. I'd raised him to see the good in people, to believe in second chances. Perhaps I'd done my job too well. His wife Tiffany was a different story entirely. From the moment Mark brought her home 6 years ago, a little alarm bell had been ringing in the back of my mind, a quiet but persistent hum of unease. It wasn't anything obvious, not at first. It was the way her eyes seemed to conduct a silent appraisal of everything they landed on, from the quality of my silverware to the age of my car. It was the way she'd compliment my home. "Oh, Carol, it's so cozy," with a tone that suggested it was 2 steps away from being condemned. It was the way she seemed more in love with the idea of Mark's career trajectory than with the man himself. I tried. Lord, how I tried to push those feelings down. I told myself I was just a protective mother, a grieving widow. I wanted my son to be happy, and she seemed to make him happy. So when they decided to buy their first home, I didn't hesitate. I went to the bank and withdrew $40,000, a significant, terrifying chunk of my retirement savings, and gave it to them for the down payment. It was a stretch, but I wanted to give them a good solid start, the kind of security Robert and I had worked our entire lives for. I spent weekends helping them paint rooms, my back aching, and planting a garden in their new yard that Tiffany never once watered. That Tuesday morning, as I pruned a stubborn, thorny branch, I heard the familiar rumble of Mark's SUV coming down the street. But something was off. The sound was too fast, the engine whining as if he'd sped up only to brake hard at the end of my driveway. Then came the slam of a car door. A sharp, angry sound that echoed in the peaceful morning air, making the birds scatter from the old oak tree. Then another slam. A cold tension coiled in my stomach. This wasn't a casual drop-in to say hi visit. What was the emergency that brought them to my doorstep on a weekday morning without so much as a phone call? I pushed myself up from the ground, my knees cracking in protest, and brushed the rich soil from my hands onto my old gardening apron. I walked around the side of the house, past the fragrant lavender bushes Robert had loved so much, and my heart gave a painful lurch. There they were. On my front porch, looking completely out of place, stood my son and his wife, but they were surrounded by a veritable mountain of luggage. 2 large, hard-shell suitcases stood beside Tiffany, with several expensive-looking designer duffel bags piled precariously on top. Mark was at the back of the SUV. His shoulders slumped as he hauled yet another bag from the trunk. It was enough luggage for a month-long European vacation. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. A plumbing disaster at their house? A sudden, unexpected trip? But my gut told me it was something far worse. Mark looked utterly defeated. His usually crisp work shirt was a mess of wrinkles. His tie was loosened and crooked, and the dark circles under his eyes were so pronounced they looked like bruises. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. His shoulders slumped not just from the weight of the bags, but from an invisible crushing burden. Tiffany, on the other hand, was a study in jarring contrast. She stood perfectly composed, one hand resting on her hip, the other clutching her phone. She was dressed in a cream-colored cashmere tracksuit that I knew for a fact cost more than my monthly mortgage payment ever had. Her blonde hair was styled in perfect, effortless waves, and her makeup was flawless, a mask of serene indifference. She looked less like someone in the throes of a crisis and more like someone impatiently waiting for a bellhop at a five-star hotel. "Mom," Mark called out, his voice sounding strained and hoarse, as if he'd been shouting for hours. "We need to talk." My hand trembled slightly as I fumbled in my apron pocket for the keys. The familiar weight of them did nothing to soothe the growing sense of dread that was creeping up my spine. I unlocked the front door, the click of the lock sounding unnaturally loud in the tense silence. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, afraid of the answer. "Is everything all right?" They followed me inside, their footsteps echoing on the polished hardwood floors that Robert and I had installed ourselves one summer. I led them to the living room, a space filled with a lifetime of memories. As Mark sank heavily into his father's old, worn recliner, the chair groaning in protest, I watched Tiffany's sharp, blue eyes dart around the room. She wasn't looking at the family photos on the mantelpiece, Mark's graduation, our last family vacation to the Grand Canyon. She wasn't noticing the hand-knitted afghan my own mother had made, draped over the sofa. No, she was scanning my furniture, my decorations, my life's possessions with a cold, appraising look. It was the look of a hawk circling its prey. The look made my skin crawl with a sudden, intense dislike. I excused myself to the kitchen, needing a moment to breathe. I poured myself a cup of coffee from the pot I'd made earlier, my hands feeling surprisingly steady. It was a strange, detached calm, the kind soldiers must feel just before a battle. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that I would need to keep a clear head. Whatever this was, it was serious. I returned to the living room, coffee cup in hand, and sat in the floral armchair opposite my son. He wouldn't meet my gaze. He just stared at his hands, which were clenched together in his lap so tightly his knuckles were bone-white. Tiffany had already resumed scrolling through her phone, utterly disengaged, as if this entire conversation was a tedious formality she had to endure. What had she done, and what had my son allowed her to do? The silence in the living room stretched on, becoming thick and suffocating. It was filled with all the things they weren't saying. I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking, each second sounding like a hammer blow against my rising anxiety. I took a sip of my coffee, the warmth doing nothing to thaw the icy dread that was spreading through my veins. Finally, Mark took a deep, shuddering breath, the sound ragged in the quiet room. He glanced nervously at Tiffany, who, without looking up from her phone, gave him a tiny, almost imperceptible nod of permission. It was a gesture so subtle, so controlling, that it made the hair on my arms stand up. It was the look of a puppet master signaling her marionette to begin the show. He finally raised his head and looked at me, his eyes filled with a heartbreaking mixture of shame and despair. "Mom," he began, his voice so quiet it was barely a whisper. "We sold the house." The words hung in the air between us, thick and heavy like smoke from a fire. I set my coffee cup down on the saucer. The clink of the ceramic was the only sound. A cold dread, sharp and sudden, pierced through my chest. My mind refused to accept it. "Which house?" I asked, my own voice sounding distant and strange, though a terrible certainty was already taking root in my stomach. "Please don't say it. Please don't say it." "Our house," he mumbled, his gaze dropping back to the floor. "The one on Maple Street. The one on Maple Street." The words felt like a physical blow. The beautiful colonial with the big, welcoming front porch, and the mighty oak tree in the backyard. The house I had poured my heart, my hope, and $40,000 of my hard-earned retirement money into. The house where I'd spent countless weekends with aching muscles, painting walls sky blue and pulling stubborn weeds, trying to create a warm and loving home for them, for the grandchildren I dreamed of holding one day. The house they had promised with beaming smiles was their forever home. "You sold it." My voice came out small, fragile, a child's voice. "Why? You didn't even tell me you were thinking about selling. We just talked about planting a new vegetable patch last month." Before Mark could formulate an answer, Tiffany spoke, her voice cool and sharp as a shard of glass. She didn't even bother to look up from her phone. "We didn't need your permission, Carol. It was our house, our decision." Her tone, the casual, cutting dismissal in her words, stung more than I could have imagined. I took a slow, deliberate breath, trying to rein in the storm of emotions brewing inside me. "I understand it's your house, Tiffany," I said, choosing my words carefully. "But I was a part of it. I helped you buy it. We talked about your plans, about raising a family there." "Plans change," Mark muttered, shifting uncomfortably in his father's recliner. He looked like a stranger to me in that moment. A wave of nausea washed over me. I felt a desperate need to understand the scale of this decision. "How much did you get for it?" $620,000, Tiffany answered immediately, and this time she did look up. There was a note of pure, undisguised triumph in her voice. A small, smug smile played on her perfectly glossed lips, as if she were sharing the most wonderful news in the world. The number knocked the wind clean out of me. $620,000. It was an astronomical sum. Fortune. It was a foundation for a secure future. A life without worry. For a fleeting moment, a tiny flicker of relief washed over me. Maybe this wasn't a disaster. Maybe they had a brilliant plan. That's wonderful," I managed to say, the words feeling like ash in my mouth. "So where are you moving? Did you find a bigger place? A better school district for the kids you wanted to have?" The silence that followed was my answer. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of guilt and shame. Mark stared at his hands again. Tiffany went back to examining her perfectly manicured nails. The triumphant smile was gone, replaced by a look of bored indifference. My fragile relief evaporated instantly, replaced by that familiar, cold dread. They had the money, but they had nowhere to go. It didn't make any sense. What in God's name had they done? "Stay here," I repeated, my voice hollow with a disbelief so profound it felt like I was in a dream. The words felt foreign and absurd in my mouth. My quiet, peaceful home, my sanctuary built for one, suddenly felt impossibly small, the walls closing in. "It would just be for a little while," Mark rushed to explain, his words tumbling over each other in a desperate, pleading torrent. "A few months, maybe. We promise we wouldn't be any trouble. We just need to get back on our feet." "Get back on your feet?" The phrase echoed in the chambers of my mind, nonsensical and utterly baffling. "Mark," I said slowly, trying to connect the dots in this insane puzzle. "You just had over $500,000 in cash. How is it possible that you are not on your feet? What on earth happened to all that money?" Another dense silence descended upon the room, this one heavier, more dangerous than all the ones that had come before. Mark looked at Tiffany, his eyes wide with a silent, desperate plea. "Help me. Tell her." She sighed, a long, theatrical sound of utter exasperation, as if my perfectly reasonable question was the most tedious and inconvenient thing she had ever been forced to endure. She elegantly smoothed down the leg of her cashmere pants. "Well," she said, her tone the one you might use to explain something very simple to a very slow child, "I had some expenses. Things I needed to take care of." "What kind of expenses?" I pressed, the knot of dread in my stomach tightening into a cold, hard stone. "What kind of expenses cost $620,000? "Personal things," she said dismissively, waving a hand adorned with a large, glittering diamond ring that I had certainly never seen before. Her tone was a brick wall, designed to end the conversation. But I was not going to be stopped. This wasn't just about curiosity. This was about my $40,000, my son's entire future, my peace of mind. "Tiffany," I said, my voice firmer now, with an edge she hadn't heard before. "You sold a house for over $600,000. What could possibly—" "I bought some jewelry," she interrupted, her voice sharp and defensive. "And some clothes. I finally got myself a Birkin bag. Do you have any idea how hard those are to get? I paid to have my car's interior completely redone in custom white leather. I took a spa and wellness trip to a 5-star resort in Napa with my sister." She ticked off the items as if they were groceries, each one a dagger in my heart. "Oh, and I paid off my credit cards." I stared at her, waiting for the rest of the explanation. The part that would make it all make sense. There had to be a logical reason. When she just sat there looking defiant, a cold dread washed over me. How much credit card debt? I asked quietly. $80,000. Mark mumbled from the depths of the recliner, his voice thick with shame. $80,000. I felt dizzy, my head light. What did she buy with $80,000 on credit cards? I asked him, my son, needing him to be the one to say it. Clothes mostly, he said, his voice barely audible. Handbags. Vacations from before we were even married. So she had brought this mountain of secret debt into their marriage, and my son had just sold his home to pay for her past extravagances. My heart ached for his foolishness. And the rest of it? I asked, my gaze shifting back to Tiffany, the architect of this ruin. What happened to the other $500,000? She looked up from her phone, her expression a mask of annoyance at my persistence. I told you I had other things. I made a major investment in my friend's new business. What kind of business? It's a lifestyle brand, she said, sounding bored and superior. It's all online. It's going to be very successful. How much did you invest, Tiffany? $300,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. I literally felt the air leave my lungs as if I'd been punched in the gut. $300,000. Into a friend's online brand. My mind was reeling, frantically trying to do the math. $80,000 for debt. $300,000 for a phantom business. That still left over $200,000. Tiffany, where is the rest of the money? What happened to the rest? I told you, she snapped, her composure finally cracking, revealing the ugly impatience beneath. Expenses. The jewelry, the spa trips, gifts for my family, some furniture for my friend's brand. Things add up, Carol. It was all gone. Every last penny. Vaporized on trinkets, on trips, on paying for past mistakes and funding future fantasies. And now they were here. Broke. Homeless. Expecting me to be the solution to the problem they had created. Was this truly my son, the responsible, thoughtful boy I had raised, sitting broken and silent in his late father's chair? I looked from my son's defeated, hollowed-out face to his wife's defiant, unrepentant one. In that terrible moment, the fog of my confusion and shock finally cleared, and it was replaced by a cold, hard, and terrifying clarity. This wasn't a one-time mistake. This wasn't a case of poor judgment. This was a demolition. Tiffany hadn't just spent their money. She had systematically dismantled my son's future, brick by brick, with a reckless abandon that bordered on malice. And he, my son, had just stood by and handed her the dynamite. So now, I said, my voice quiet but as steady as a rock, you want to live here. Just temporarily, Mark repeated, the words sounding hollow and rehearsed, as if Tiffany had coached him on what to say. I let my gaze travel around my small living room. I looked at the grandfather clock in the corner that my husband's father had built with his own 2 hands. I looked at the faded floral armchair where I had read hundreds of bedtime stories to Mark when he was a little boy. This was my safe haven, the result of a lifetime of careful saving, of turning down vacations, of driving the same car for 10 years. It was not a flop house for the financially and morally bankrupt. And what is your plan? I asked, my gaze fixed on Tiffany, bypassing my son entirely. How exactly do you intend to get back on your feet? She and Mark exchanged a look, a quick, panicked glance, and I knew in that instant they didn't have a plan. They had an assumption. They had an expectation. They had me. Well, Tiffany said, taking charge as she always did, her voice regaining its smooth, confident tone. Mark will keep working, obviously. He's got his job. And I'm sure the brand will start turning a profit soon. She shrugged, a casual, dismissive gesture that made my blood boil with a sudden hot rage. And if it doesn't, we'll figure something else out. We'll figure something else out. The audacity of it, the sheer breathtaking entitlement was staggering. She spoke as if she were a child who had spent her allowance and was now simply expecting a refill. She expected to be taken care of. She expected me to be the safety net that she had so casually and completely shredded. And that's when I knew what I had to do. Not just for me. Not just for my home. But for Mark. Sometimes the cruelest thing you can do for someone is to save them from the consequences of their own choices. And sometimes the kindest thing is to let them fall. No, I said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the center of the room with the force of a physical blow. What? Mark looked up, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and disbelief. Tiffany's perfectly sculpted eyebrows shot up toward her hairline. I said no, I repeated, my voice gaining strength with each syllable. I stood up from my armchair, my body feeling surprisingly strong, anchored by a resolve I didn't know I possessed. You cannot stay here. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Mark's face crumpled in despair. Mom, you can't be serious. We're family. We have nowhere else to go. Yes, we are family, I replied, my voice steady and clear. And as family, I refuse to enable this catastrophe you've created. I will not stand by and watch you throw your life away, Mark. And I will not allow my home, your father's home, to become a casualty of your wife's reckless spending and breathtaking irresponsibility. Tiffany slammed her phone down on my coffee table, the crack of plastic on wood echoing in the tense silence. Enable? Catastrophe? My husband made a business decision. Not every investment pays off immediately. A business decision? I couldn't keep the incredulous, bitter laugh out of my voice. Spending over $500,000 on Birkin bags, spa trips, and your friend's Instagram page is not a business decision, Tiffany. It's a 5-alarm fire of narcissism and greed. What would this entitled woman do now that her perfect plan had just hit a brick wall named Carol Mitchell? Tiffany's face, which had been a mask of cool composure, twisted into an ugly snarl of pure rage. How dare you? She shrieked, jumping to her feet. Her voice was shrill, grating. How dare you judge me? You sit here in this tiny little museum with your ancient furniture and your faded second-hand clothes. You've never had anything nice in your entire life. You wouldn't understand what it's like to have standards, to want more for yourself. The insult was meant to cut deep, and it did. She was mocking a life of careful, honest work, a life of finding joy in things other than material possessions. But I refused to let her see the hurt. No, Tiffany, I said, my voice dangerously calm. I don't know what it's like to have your kind of standards. My standards involve not stealing from my family, and not expecting other people to clean up my messes. Mom, please, Mark begged, his face flushed with a deep, painful shame as he turned from the window. Tiffany made some mistakes. Some mistakes. I interrupted, my patience completely shredded. Mark, she burned through your entire future in a matter of months. This isn't a mistake. This is a character flaw. A fatal one. You don't know anything about our marriage. Tiffany hissed, her eyes blazing. You have no idea what it's like to be married to someone who pinches every single penny, who never wants to do anything fun or exciting. She was trying to paint my son, a man who worked 60-hour weeks to provide for her, as a cheapskate. The injustice of it was staggering. I know what it's like to live within my means, I shot back. I know what it's like to save for the things I want instead of just taking them and expecting someone else to pay the price. Her face contorted. Oh, aren't you just perfect, Carol? The perfect little saint in her perfect little life. You've hated me since day one because you couldn't stand that Mark finally had a woman in his life who wasn't his mommy. With that, she spun around and stormed toward the front door. But she didn't just leave. This was Tiffany. She needed an audience. She needed to inflict maximum damage. She yanked the door open with such force that it slammed against the interior wall, the sound echoing through the house like a gunshot. My neighbors, the Millers, were in their front yard across the street, raking the last of the autumn leaves. Their heads snapped up at the commotion. This was exactly what Tiffany wanted. A stage. You want to know what kind of woman Carol Mitchell really is? She shouted, her voice carrying across the quiet, peaceful street. She pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at me, standing in my own doorway. She's the kind of woman who throws her own son out on the street. Her own flesh and blood. My cheeks burned with a humiliation so intense it felt like a physical heat. My quiet street, my peaceful neighborhood, where I had lived for 30 years, was now transformed into the stage for Tiffany's deranged and calculated 1-0-man show. She began to cry, but they were not the tears of a wounded person. They were the tears of a performer, perfectly timed and executed for maximum effect. We just asked for a little help, she wailed, her voice breaking dramatically as she took a few steps onto the porch, ensuring everyone could see and hear her. Just a temporary place to stay while we got back on our feet. We lost everything, and this heartless woman said no. To her only child. Mrs. Miller took a step closer to the edge of her lawn, her face a mask of concern and rapt curiosity. I felt like a bug under a microscope, pinned and exposed. This was a nightmare. This was the ultimate violation. Not just of my home, but of my reputation, my dignity, my quiet life. I had to end this. I stepped out onto the porch, my hands clenched into tight, white-knuckled fists at my sides. "That's enough, Tiffany," I said, my voice low and trembling with a rage I had never known I possessed. "Get off my property. Now." She whirled around to face me, a twisted, triumphant smile on her tear-streaked face. "Oh, it's not nearly enough," she sneered, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper meant only for me. "You think you're so much better than me. But you're nothing. Just a sad old woman. And you're about to learn what happens when you cross me." What more could she possibly do to humiliate me in front of my entire world? In front of my neighbors, in front of the peaceful street I called home, in front of God and everyone. Tiffany Mitchell raised her hand. The world seemed to slow to a crawl. I saw the movement, a blur of cream-colored cashmere. I saw the glint of the new diamond ring on her finger, a ring bought with my son's future. I saw the ugly, contorted fury in her eyes. I saw my son Mark take a half-step forward from the doorway, his mouth open as if to shout a warning, but no sound came out. He was a statue in a diorama of my humiliation. Then the world exploded in a crack of sound and a burst of white-hot pain. Her hand connected with my cheek. Hard. The force of it snapped my head to the side, and I staggered back a step, my hand flying to my face. The sound, a sharp, ugly, wet smack, echoed across the unnaturally quiet street. It was a sound of violence, a sound that did not belong here. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, there was absolute silence. Even the autumn leaves seemed to have stopped rustling. The Millers stood frozen in their yard, Mr. Miller's rake halfway to the ground, his mouth agape. Their teenage son, who had been riding his bike in circles, had stopped, one foot on the pavement, staring with wide, disbelieving eyes. My hand was pressed to my cheek, which was already stinging, throbbing with a pain that was a distant second to the profound, soul-crushing shock. More than the physical pain, I felt a deep, searing humiliation. I had been physically assaulted on my own front porch, by my daughter-in-law, for the whole world to see. I lowered my hand and looked at my son. This was the moment, the final moment, the point of no return. This was the moment for him to finally wake up, to defend his mother, to show some sliver of the man I had raised, to show some outrage that his wife had just crossed a sacred line from which there was no coming back. Instead, he just stood there, paralyzed. His face was a canvas of confusion and horror, but he did nothing. He said nothing. He didn't move toward me to see if I was okay. He didn't move toward her to restrain her. He just stood in the wreckage she had created, a silent, spineless monument to her complete and utter victory over him. And in that moment of his deafening silence, my heart, which had already been cracked and broken, shattered into a million irreparable pieces. My voice, when it finally came, was eerily calm, devoid of all emotion. "Did you just hit me?" I asked quietly, my gaze locked on Tiffany, who was breathing heavily, a look of shocked triumph on her face. She lifted her chin, defiant and completely unrepentant. "You deserved it," she spat, her voice dripping with venom. "Throwing your own family out on the street like common trash." I looked past her, at the horrified faces of my neighbors. Mrs. Miller's hand was over her mouth. They had seen it all. I turned my eyes back to my son, my only child. "Mark," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "your wife just assaulted me, and you're just going to stand there and let her?" "Mom, he stammered, his eyes pleading, lost. "She's just upset. She didn't mean it. She didn't mean it." Before I could even respond to that staggering absurdity, Tiffany stepped between us, puffing out her chest. "Don't you try to play the victim here, Carol," she sneered. "You brought this on yourself." That was it. The last straw. The grief inside me, the heartbreak for my son. It all crystallized into something hard and unyielding. Steel. I pulled my cell phone from my apron pocket. Tiffany laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "What are you going to do?" Call the police? Don't be ridiculous. I didn't say a single word. I just dialed 911 without ever breaking eye contact with her. As the phone began to ring in my ear, I saw her defiant smirk falter for the first time, replaced by the first flicker of genuine raw panic. What would you have done if you were in my place? After being stolen from, insulted, and then physically assaulted on your own property, what would have been your next move? Let me know in the comments below. The change in Tiffany's demeanor was as sudden as it was dramatic. The moment she heard my calm, clear voice giving my address to the 911 dispatcher, her mask of righteous fury crumbled into pure, unadulterated panic. The color drained from her face. "Hang up that phone," she hissed, her voice a frantic whisper as she grabbed Mark's arm. "Mark, tell your mother to hang up the phone right now." But I was already explaining the situation to the calm voice on the other end of the line. "Yes, my daughter-in-law. Her name is Tiffany Mitchell. She just assaulted me on my front porch. There are multiple witnesses. I need an officer to come and remove her from my property immediately." When I ended the call, Tiffany was staring at me, her mouth agape in utter disbelief. "You actually called the police?" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "On your own family?" "No," I said, my voice as cold and hard as the new steel in my spine. "I called the police on the woman who just assaulted me." The 10 minutes it took for the patrol car to arrive felt like an eternity suspended in time. Tiffany alternated between whispering frantically and furiously to Mark and shooting venomous, hateful glares at me. The Millers and my other neighbors remained in their yards, a silent, watchful jury to the entire sordid affair. I simply stood my ground on my porch, my hand still throbbing where she had struck me. 2 officers arrived, a younger, sharp-eyed woman named Martinez and an older, weary-looking man named Thompson, who looked like he'd seen far too much family drama in his career. Officer Martinez approached me first, her expression professional but not unkind. "Ma'am," she said gently, "we received a call about an assault." "Yes," I said, my voice clear and steady, gesturing to my still red and swelling cheek. "This woman, my daughter-in-law, slapped me across the face." Officer Thompson turned his tired eyes to Tiffany. "Is this true, ma'am?" She was being unreasonable. Tiffany cried, immediately launching into her performance, tears welling in her eyes. "She was throwing us out. We have nowhere to go. It was a family dispute that got out of hand. That doesn't give you the right to put your hands on anyone," Officer Martinez said firmly, her voice cutting through Tiffany's hysterics. She turned back to me. "Ma'am, do you wish to press charges?" This was the final crossroad. This was the moment that would define the rest of my life, the rest of my relationship with my son. I looked at Mark, who stood beside his mountain of designer luggage, his head bowed in shame, still saying nothing in my defense. He had made his choice through his silence. Now it was time for me to make mine. "Yes," I said quietly, but with all the conviction in my soul. "I do." Tiffany's face went bone white. "You can't be serious." "Assault is a serious charge, ma'am," Officer Thompson said, his voice flat and unimpressed. He gestured toward my neighbors. "And we have multiple witnesses who saw the entire thing." As if on cue, when Officer Martinez glanced toward Mrs. Miller, she nodded vigorously. "I saw it all," she called out, her voice clear. She hit Carol right across the face, unprovoked. As they placed Tiffany in handcuffs, she turned to Mark, her voice shrill with desperation. "Mark, don't just stand there like an idiot. Do something." But he was frozen, a statue of regret, watching his wife being arrested on his mother's front lawn. He finally looked at me, his eyes filled with a pained, desperate accusation. "Mom, did you really have to do this? Your wife assaulted me and you did nothing," I said, the words feeling like stones in my mouth. "Yes, Mark. I really had to." As the police car pulled away, taking Tiffany with it, Mark slowly, mechanically, loaded his bags back into his SUV. He looked lost. He looked broken. But he had made his bed. Was this truly the end of my relationship with my only son? Or the beginning of his rescue? Watching my son's SUV disappear down the street, leaving me alone on my porch, I felt a loneliness so profound it was a physical ache deep in my chest. The street was quiet again, unnaturally so. The neighbors had retreated into their homes, no doubt their phones buzzing with the morning's shocking drama. I walked back inside, the silence of my house pressing in on me from all sides. My cheek throbbed, a dull, constant reminder of the violation. Later that day, I drove to the police station to give a formal statement. My voice never wavered as I recounted every detail of the confrontation, from the squandered money to the final violent slap. That evening I sat at my kitchen table, a cup of chamomile tea growing cold in my hands. I couldn't eat. I couldn't think. Pressing charges was just the first step. I knew Tiffany. She was a fighter and she fought dirty. This was far from over. They would be back somehow, some way, with new demands, new manipulations. I felt emotionally and financially drained. The thought of the $40,000 I had given them gnawed at me like a hungry animal. It represented years of my life, of Robert's life, of careful saving and sacrificing little luxuries. It had all been turned into expensive trinkets and spa trips by a woman with a shopping addiction and no conscience. But then, through the fog of my grief and anger, a memory surfaced. It was faint and dusty, a recollection from 3 years ago, in a stuffy lawyer's office downtown. When I'd given them the money, it had been a gift in my heart, an investment in my son's happiness. But my lawyer at the time, a shrewd, no-nonsense old man named James Davies, had been insistent. "Carol," he had said, his voice firm as he looked at me over the top of his spectacles, "I strongly recommend we structure this as a formal loan, not a gift. It protects your interests. You never know what the future holds." At the time I had protested. "But he's my son, James," I'd argued. But Mark himself, full of pride and good intentions back then, had insisted on agreeing with the lawyer. "Mom, I want to pay you back," he'd said earnestly. "This should be official. It's the right way to do it." My heart started to beat a little faster, a tiny flicker of hope in the darkness. I went to the old metal filing cabinet in my spare bedroom, the one filled with decades of a life's paperwork. I pulled out the drawer labeled financial and started digging, my fingers trembling with a new urgency. I flipped past old tax returns and bank statements, the paper thin and soft with age. And then I saw it, a folder neatly labeled, "Mark House Purchase." My breath caught. Inside, nestled among copies of the deed and the closing statements, was a document I had almost completely forgotten about. A promissory note. It was all there in crisp official black and white. A loan of $40,000, to be repaid with 5% annual interest. And then my eyes fell on the most important clause, the one Mr. Davies had insisted upon, the one I now understood was a shield he had forged for me years ago. "This loan is secured by the property at 125 Maple Street, Cleveland, Ohio." It was a lien, a legal recorded interest in their house. They had sold the house without paying back the secured loan. They had sold property that was, in part, legally and financially mine. They hadn't just been immoral, they had broken the law. A fire I hadn't felt in years began to burn in my chest. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the principle. It was about the lies, the manipulation, the humiliation, the slap. Tiffany had started a war, but I had just found my heavy artillery. I picked up the phone and dialed the number for James Davies, attorney at law. What would he say? Was this dusty old paper truly the key to getting the justice I so desperately needed? Mr. Davies, though now semi-retired, remembered my case instantly. He agreed to see me the very next morning. I barely slept that night, my mind racing, a powerful mix of raw anxiety and a newfound, steely resolve coursing through my veins. In his quiet, book-lined office that smelled of old paper and leather, I laid out the whole sordid story for him. He listened patiently, his face growing grimmer with each detail, making careful notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he looked at the promissory note, running a finger over the clause about the lien. He then looked up at me, his eyes sharp. "Carol," he said, his voice grave and serious, "this is more than just a family dispute. By selling that house without satisfying your lien, they committed a tort known as conversion of secured property. You have a very, very strong case here." He advised me to file a civil lawsuit immediately, not just for the original $40,000, but for 3 years of accrued interest, plus legal fees and punitive damages for the fraudulent nature of the act. The total came to around $67,000. I took a deep, steadying breath and told him to file the papers. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of control, of power. But I had severely underestimated Tiffany's capacity for treachery and her willingness to scorch the earth around her. 2 days later, just as I was beginning to feel a sense of forward momentum, my phone rang. It was my younger sister, Susan, calling from her home in Naples, Florida. Her voice, usually so warm and cheerful, was strained, filled with a pained confusion that bordered on accusation. "Carol, what on earth is going on up there?" she asked without so much as a hello. "I just got off the phone with Tiffany." She was sobbing, absolutely hysterical. It was the most heartbreaking thing I've ever heard. My blood ran cold. "What did she tell you, Susan?" I asked, my voice tight. "She told me Mark lost his job and had some kind of mental breakdown," Susan said, her words rushing out in a worried torrent. "She said you've always hated her, that you saw this as your chance and you're trying to take all their house money. She told me you attacked her when she came to you for help, and then you twisted the whole story to the police. Carol, she made it sound like you're some kind of monster. She said you're trying to destroy their marriage. What is happening?" I felt the floor drop out from under me. The audacity of it. The sheer, calculated evil. Tiffany wasn't just fighting me with lawyers. She was trying to poison my entire family against me, to isolate me, to paint me as the villain in her twisted narrative, so that no one would believe me. She was trying to strip me of my support system. "Susan, listen to me very carefully," I said, my voice shaking with a fury I could barely contain. "Every single word that woman told you is a lie. A vicious, manipulative lie." It took me nearly an hour to walk my own sister through the truth. My voice cracked as I had to recount every humiliating detail. The squandered money, the public screaming match on my lawn, the violence of the slap across my face. I promised to email her a copy of the official police report as proof. By the end of the call, Susan was crying, not for Tiffany but for me. "Oh, Carol, I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice thick with shame. "I can't believe I almost fell for it. That woman is pure poison." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen trembling with rage. This was a new level of warfare. This wasn't just about money or housing anymore. This was a battle for my family, for my reputation, for the very truth itself. The rage that filled me was cold and pure. She had tried to turn my own sister against me. She had crossed a final unforgivable line. I picked up the phone and called Mr. Davies again. "I have an update," I said, my voice devoid of any warmth or weakness. "And another request. I want you to hire the best private investigator you can find. I don't care what it costs. I want to know everything there is to know about Tiffany Mitchell. Dig up everything." If she wanted to play dirty, I was about to find out just how deep her dirt really went. A week later, I was sitting across from Mr. Davies again in his office. The afternoon sun streamed through the blinds, casting long stripes across the room. A thick manila folder lay on the polished desk between us. The air felt heavy, charged with the secrets contained within its pages. "Carol," he began, his voice low and serious as he folded his hands on top of the folder. "The investigator we hired is very good. What he found is disturbing. I think you should prepare yourself." He opened the folder, and for the next hour, he laid out a history of deception so calculated and predatory it made me feel physically ill. It was a portrait of a woman who didn't just make mistakes, but who actively and purposefully destroyed lives for her own gain. First, there was her financial history before she had even laid eyes on my son. Tiffany, it turned out, had been engaged twice before Mark. Both relationships had ended abruptly and disastrously. In both cases, her fiancés discovered she had secretly opened high-limit credit cards in their names and maxed them out on luxury goods, trips, and gifts for herself. One man, a young doctor just starting his practice, was left with over $50,000 in debt that ruined his credit for years. She had a clear, established pattern of financial predation, of using men as disposable assets. Then came the lifestyle brand she had so proudly invested $300,000 of my son's money in. As I had suspected, it was a complete and utter sham. Her friend was a former associate from a previous scam in another state. The investigator found no business license, no inventory, no tax records, no evidence of any legitimate commercial activity whatsoever. The money had been transferred to the friend's shell corporation and had immediately been wired to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. It had vanished. It wasn't a bad investment, It was a premeditated, well-executed theft. I felt sick to my stomach, a wave of nausea washing over me. But Mr. Davies held up a hand, his expression pained. "There's more, Carol," he said, his eyes filled with a deep sympathy. "And this is the worst part." He slid a series of high-resolution photographs across the desk. They showed Tiffany, looking radiant and carefree with another man. He was handsome, older, impeccably dressed in expensive suits, with a confident, powerful air about him. There were photos of them dining at Michelin-starred restaurants in Chicago, coming out of the side entrance of a luxury hotel, kissing passionately in a park, Tiffany's head thrown back in laughter. "Her lover's name is Richard Hawthorne," Mr. Davies explained gently. "A very wealthy and very married real estate developer based in Chicago. The affair, Carol, has been going on for over a year. It appears that the majority of the money from your son's house sale was used to fund this relationship. The new jewelry, the trips, the expensive clothes. It was all part of the elaborate lifestyle she was living with him, behind your son's back." The room began to spin. Every lie, every expense, every strange mood swing suddenly clicked into place with horrifying, sickening clarity. The sudden need for cash, the desperation to sell the house. It all made sense now. "The investigator spoke to a source close to Hawthorne's wife," Mr. Davies continued, his voice soft. "She discovered the affair 2 months ago and gave her husband an ultimatum: end it or lose half of everything. He cut Tiffany off completely, changed his numbers, blocked her everywhere. That's why she suddenly needed a place to live, Carol. Her sugar daddy had run dry. My son. My dear, trusting, hard-working son. He hadn't just been a husband. He had been a placeholder. An ATM. The unwitting, cuckolded bankroll for his own wife's sordid affair. The betrayal was so immense, so monstrous I could barely breathe. Thank you so much for your patience in following my story. If you've watched this far, please comment with the number 1. So I know you're still with me on this journey. It means so much to not feel alone in this. Now I was faced with the most terrible choice of my life. Do I tell my son a truth that would absolutely shatter his world? The weight of that horrible secret sat on my chest like a physical stone for 24 agonizing hours. I paced my living room, unable to eat or sleep. How do you tell your only child that his entire marriage, the life he had been working so hard to build, was a complete and utter lie? How do you explain that the woman he loved had been systematically deceiving and robbing him to fund a secret life with another man? It felt like handing him a vial of poison, but keeping it from him, letting him continue to believe even a shred of her lies, felt like a different, more insidious kind of betrayal. He deserved to know who he had married. He deserved the truth, no matter how ugly and devastating it was. With a heavy heart I called Mark. He was staying at a cheap motel across town. I didn't tell him why, only that it was urgent and that he needed to meet me at Mr. Davies' office. He sounded tired and wary on the phone, his voice flat and defeated, but he agreed to come. When he walked into the conference room, he looked 10 years older than he had just a few weeks ago. The stress had carved deep lines into his face, and he'd lost weight he couldn't afford to lose. He sat down heavily in the leather chair, avoiding my eyes. "What is this, Mom? More legal stuff?" I didn't speak. I simply looked at him with all the love and sorrow in my heart and nodded to Mr. Davies. Gently but methodically, my lawyer began to speak. He laid out the entire contents of the investigator's folder, not as accusations but as facts. He presented the evidence of Tiffany's past financial scams, showing Mark that he was not the first victim, but merely the latest in a long line. He showed him the bank transfers and shell corporation documents that proved the lifestyle brand was a premeditated fraud. And then, with a deep sigh, he laid the glossy photographs on the polished mahogany table. Mark stared at the picture of his wife kissing another man. His face, which had been pale and tired, turned a ghostly waxy white. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stared, his breath catching in his throat with a small choked sound. The color of the sky, the expressions on their faces, the intimacy of the moment. It was all there in high-definition cruelty. I then told him about the phone call. "She called Aunt Susan, Mark," I said softly, my voice breaking. "She told her you'd had a mental breakdown, that I was a monster trying to steal your money. She tried to turn our whole family against me, to isolate us." That was what finally broke him. It wasn't the money. It wasn't even the affair. It was the calculated cruelty of it, the realization that her malice wasn't just directed at him, but at everyone he loved. A single tear rolled down his cheek, then another. He finally looked up, his eyes swimming with a pain so deep and profound it took my breath away. "All this time," he whispered, his voice hoarse with disbelief, I thought I was the problem. And then the dam broke." He started to talk, the words pouring out of him in a torrent of long-suppressed pain. He told us how for years, Tiffany had chipped away at his self-confidence, how she belittled his job, his friends, his family. She had isolated him, convincing him that he was lucky, that someone as sophisticated and exciting as her would even look at a simple man like him. He'd been living in a thick fog of emotional abuse and gaslighting, constantly feeling like he wasn't good enough, always trying to earn her affection, which she doled out and withheld like a weapon to control him. He buried his face in his hands, and his body shook with silent, racking sobs. I moved to his side, wrapping my arms around his shaking shoulders. All my anger at his inaction on my porch vanished, replaced by an overwhelming wave of love and sorrow for my wounded son. He hadn't been weak. He had been a victim, systematically broken down and trapped in a cage he couldn't even see. But what he confessed next revealed the true genius of Tiffany's evil, and why he had been so utterly terrified to fight back against her. As Mark's heart-wrenching sobs subsided into shuddering breaths, he wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and looked at Mr. Davies, then at me. There was a new frightening layer of shame in his eyes, a secret he had been carrying alone for far too long. "There's something else," he said, his voice barely a whisper, thick with self-loathing. "Something she has on me. It's why I was so scared. Why I always gave in." He explained that early in their marriage, when they had been struggling to make ends meet, Tiffany, always looking for a shortcut, a way to live beyond their means, had convinced him to make a few small compromises. When they had applied for a loan to buy a new car they couldn't really afford, she had filled out the application and had him inflate his income. "Just by a little bit," she had cooed, stroking his arm. "Everybody does it, Mark. It's how you get ahead in this world. It's not hurting anyone." Another year, when he had done some freelance graphic design work for cash, she had persuaded him not to report the few $1,000s on their taxes. "Don't be a fool," she chided, her voice a mix of seduction and scorn. "Why would you give the government money that we need right now?" He was young, desperately in love, and so eager to please her, so desperate to give her the lifestyle she claimed she deserved. He was deeply ashamed of it now, but at the time, caught in her web, he had gone along with it. And here was the truly diabolical part, the move that showed her calculated long-term evil. Tiffany, under the guise of being organized, had kept meticulous copies of everything. The falsified loan application with his forged signature on the income statement. The tax documents that clearly omitted the cash income he had earned. She had stored them all neatly in a password-protected file on her laptop. A file she ominously called, "Our Financial Records." He thought she was just being responsible. He never suspected she was building his prison. "A few months ago," Mark said, his voice hollow and dead, "we got into a huge argument about money. I told her we couldn't afford a trip to Paris she wanted to take for her birthday. She got this cold, flat look in her eyes, a look I'd never seen before, and she said, 'Don't you ever forget that I know all of our little secrets. It would be a terrible shame if something happened and the IRS or the bank found out about them. You could lose your professional license, Mark. You could lose your career. You could lose everything. Are you sure we can't afford that trip?' I stared at him in utter horror. It wasn't just emotional abuse. It was cold, premeditated blackmail. She had spent years carefully building a cage around him, not with bars of steel, but with pages of incriminating financial documents. She had systematically compromised him, not for immediate gain, but to create leverage, an insurance policy to ensure that if he ever tried to leave or defy her, she could destroy his life with a single anonymous email. His passivity on my front porch, his frozen terror, it hadn't been cowardice. It had been the paralyzing fear of a man who knew his captor held the keys to his complete and utter ruin. Mr. Davies listened to the entire confession, his expression grim and hard. When Mark was finished, he leaned forward, his voice firm. "This is serious, Mark," he said. "But her threat is a double-edged sword. She was a party to these actions. This isn't just your crime. It's her crime. The best way to defang a blackmailer," he said, a shrewd glint in his eye, "is to expose the secret yourself but on your own terms." The very next morning Mark, accompanied by Mr. Davies, walked into the local IRS office. My son, with his head held high for the first time in years, voluntarily disclosed every financial misstep he had ever made under his wife's influence. He was ready to face the penalties, the fines, whatever came his way. He was taking his power back. The last piece of leverage Tiffany thought she had was gone, turned to ash. Now there was nothing left for her to hide behind. All that was left was the final showdown in court. The day of our court date, the air in the municipal courtroom was stale and heavy with the scent of old wood and disinfectant. I sat beside Mark at the plaintiff's table, my hands folded calmly in my lap over my best purse. Mark was nervous, I could see his leg bouncing slightly, but when he caught my eye he gave me a small determined nod. He was no longer a broken man. He was a man ready to face the truth. Tiffany entered with her lawyer, a sharp-looking woman in a power suit who radiated an aura of expensive confidence. Tiffany herself was dressed for a masterful performance. She wore a conservative high-necked navy blue dress. Her makeup was subdued and tasteful, and her expression was one of brave, wounded innocence. She was playing the part of the wronged wife, the misunderstood victim of a vindictive mother-in-law who had maliciously torn her family apart. She pointedly refused to look at me or Mark, keeping her gaze fixed on the judge's bench as if seeking sanctuary. Her lawyer went first, and she painted a masterpiece of fiction. In her telling, Tiffany was a young, naive woman who, yes, had made some unwise but understandable financial choices, overwhelmed by the pressures of modern life. She was a loving wife who had been relentlessly persecuted by a jealous and controlling mother-in-law. The lawyer argued that the $40,000 had been a gift, a loving family gesture, not a loan, and that my lawsuit was nothing more than malicious harassment, a legal tool to interfere in my son's marriage and seize their assets. When it was Mr. Davies' turn, he didn't engage in theatrics. He was a bastion of calm, dignified facts. He simply, methodically began to construct the case for the truth. He produced the original, signed promissory note, getting Tiffany to admit on the stand that the signature was indeed hers. He showed the court the certified mail receipts from the 2 times I had formally requested payment over the years, which had been signed for and subsequently ignored. He submitted the official police report from the assault, along with signed, notarized affidavits from 2 of my neighbors, the Millers, detailing the public tirade and the physical attack. He presented the mountain of bank statements and credit card bills showing the whirlwind of spending, a clear and undeniable pattern of dissipation of marital assets with nothing to show for it. The judge, a stern-faced woman in her 60s named Judge Harris, looked at the growing pile of evidence, her expression remaining unreadable, a stony mask of judicial neutrality. Then Mr. Davies cleared his throat and said, "Your Honor, the plaintiff calls Richard Hawthorne to the stand." A collective gasp went through the small courtroom gallery. Tiffany's head snapped up, her face draining of all color so quickly she looked like she might faint. Her lawyer shot to her feet, shouting objection, relevance. But the judge waved her down with an impatient flick of her wrist. Overruled. He will be heard. A well-dressed man in his 50s, looking deeply uncomfortable and angry, walked grimly to the witness stand. It was him. The man from the photographs. Richard Hawthorne. Under oath, looking anywhere but at Tiffany, Richard reluctantly told the truth. He confirmed the year-long affair. He testified that Tiffany had told him she was in the process of divorcing an abusive, emotionally controlling husband. He revealed, his voice filled with disgust, that she had claimed her family was wealthy but that her wicked mother-in-law was trying to steal her inheritance, and she needed money to maintain her lifestyle during the protracted legal battle. "She told me," Richard said, his voice firm, "that she was a victim. She lied about absolutely everything." Mr. Davies approached the witness stand for the final, critical question. "Mr. Hawthorne, were you aware that the money Ms. Mitchell was spending on your trips together, on the jewelry she claimed you bought her, was from the sale of her marital home, a home she shared with the very husband she claimed was abusing her?" Richard's face hardened into a mask of contempt. "No. he said firmly. I was not. If I had known I was involved in something so sordid, I would have ended it immediately. The courtroom was utterly, deathly silent. Tiffany's carefully constructed facade of victimhood had not just been cracked. It had been systematically and completely obliterated. How could her lawyer or anyone possibly recover from a blow like that? Tiffany's lawyer, for all her expensive confidence, was visibly flustered. She tried her best to do damage control, cross-examining Richard Hawthorne by attempting to paint him as an unreliable witness, a scorned man trying to save his own skin. She argued passionately that the affair, while unfortunate and a sign of an unhappy marriage, was a private matter and had no legal bearing on what was essentially a financial dispute between family members. But it was no use. The web of lies had been too vast, the deception too profound, and now it had been fully exposed to the harsh, unforgiving light of the courtroom. Judge Harris, who had been listening with an expression of growing impatience and disgust, finally turned her steely gaze directly on Tiffany. "Ms. Mitchell," she said, her voice cutting through the tense silence of the courtroom like a surgeon's scalpel. "Please rise." Tiffany stood, trembling visibly, her lawyer placing a steadying hand on her arm. "Ms. Mitchell, do you dispute that this is your signature on this legally binding promissory note?" the judge asked, holding up the document for her to see. "No, Your Honor, but—" "Do you dispute?" the judge cut her off, her voice rising with authority. "That for 3 years you failed to make a single payment on this debt while simultaneously racking up tens of thousands of dollars in personal consumer debt? Well, our circumstances were complicated." "Do you dispute," the judge continued, her voice now booming with indignation, "that you and your husband sold the very property that secured this loan and made no attempt whatsoever to satisfy the lien held by your mother-in-law, Mrs. Mitchell, the woman whose money helped you acquire that property in the first place? I didn't understand the legal implications. You didn't understand that when you borrow money, you are obligated to pay it back?" Judge Harris's voice was laced with ice. "You seem to have a very clear and sophisticated understanding of how to spend money, Ms. Mitchell. It's the paying of it back that seems to confuse you." The judge then looked down at the pile of notes and evidence before her. She took a deep breath, and when she spoke again, her voice was filled with a cold, righteous anger that seemed to fill the entire room. "Mrs. Lennox Mitchell," she began, her eyes boring into Tiffany, "in my 15 years on this bench, I have rarely seen such a clear-cut and appalling case of financial fraud, emotional manipulation, and blatant disrespect for both family and the law. You entered into a legal agreement with your husband's mother, a woman who generously helped you buy your first home out of love for her son. You then ignored your obligation for years while, as has been made abundantly clear today, you systematically squandered over $500,000 of your husband's assets on personal luxuries and a sordid extramarital affair." Tiffany began to sob, but they were no longer the calculated tears of a performer. They were the raw, ugly sobs of a cornered, defeated animal. When your benefactor and victim had the audacity to refuse to house you after you single-handedly set fire to your own life, the judge continued, her voice thundering, you repaid her generosity by physically assaulting her in a public and humiliating fashion. You then attempted to use this legal system as a tool to further harass her. This court will not allow that. It will not be a party to your schemes. She picked up her gavel. The sound it made when it struck the block was final. Absolute. A full stop to Tiffany's reign of destruction. I am ruling entirely in favor of the plaintiff. You are ordered to pay Mrs. Carol Mitchell the full amount of $67,000 within 30 days. Furthermore, I am forwarding the entire transcript of this case, including the evidence of financial deception and the fraudulent investment scheme, to the district attorney's office with my strongest recommendation that they pursue criminal fraud charges against you. This court is adjourned. It was over. Justice, swift and absolute, had finally been served. A year can change everything. A year can heal wounds you thought were fatal. The following autumn, I wasn't in my garden in Ohio, bundled against the Midwestern chill. I was sitting on the screened-in lanai of my new, sun-drenched condo in Fort Myers, Florida, a gentle breeze rustling the palm fronds outside. After the court case, I realized the house in Cleveland, the house I had loved so much, now held too many painful memories. Every corner seemed to echo with that terrible day. So I sold it, took the proceeds, and started over. I found a lovely, quiet retirement community with a vibrant garden club and friendly neighbors who valued peace and a good book as much as I did. My new garden was filled with hibiscus, bougainvillea, and fragrant gardenias, plants that thrived in the warmth and constant sunshine. I was thriving too. The aftermath of the court case was as swift as it was decisive. Tiffany, facing criminal charges and with no assets to her name, eventually pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of theft by deception. She received 5 years of probation and a court order for restitution that she will likely be paying for the rest of her life. Her life of luxury, built on lies and other people's money, was over. Mark, my son, faced his own consequences, but he faced them with a courage and honesty that made me prouder than I have ever been. He paid a significant fine to the IRS but, because of his voluntary disclosure, avoided any criminal charges. He lost his job at the big firm, but he found a new one at a smaller, local company that valued his honesty about his past and was willing to give him a second chance. He moved into a small, clean apartment that he could comfortably afford, and for the first time in years he was in control of his own life. He started making monthly payments to me on the $67,000 judgment, insisting, despite my protests, on paying back every single penny. "It's not about the money, Mom," he told me on one of his visits. "It's about making things right. It's about becoming the man Dad would have wanted me to be." He flies down to visit me once a month, and our relationship is stronger, deeper, and more honest than it has ever been. We walked through the fire and we came out the other side changed but intact. One afternoon, sorting through my mail, I found a handwritten letter with an unfamiliar return address from Illinois. Curious, I opened it. The letter was from a man I didn't know, but whose story I recognized. He was one of the fiancés Tiffany had scammed before she met Mark. He had read about my court case in an online news article. "Dear Mrs. Mitchell," he wrote, "I am writing to you today to thank you. For years I was too ashamed and embarrassed to tell anyone what she did to me and my finances. I just tried to forget it. Seeing you stand up to her, seeing you fight back and win, it gave me the courage to finally seek legal action myself to recover some of what I lost. You are an inspiration. Thank you for your strength." I held the letter to my chest, hot tears welling in my eyes. I had fought for myself and my son, but in doing so I had inadvertently fought for others too. I had given a voice to another victim who had been silenced by shame. Sitting there on my lanai watching the sun set over the palm trees, I realized that at 64, my life hadn't ended. It had just begun a new, stronger, and more peaceful chapter. I learned that kindness is not weakness and that setting boundaries is not cruelty, but the highest form of self-respect. Sometimes the most important battles are the ones you never wanted to fight, but in fighting them, you discover a strength you never knew you had. My story has a resolution, but I know many of you watching might be in the middle of your own battle, big or small. What would you have done if you were in my shoes? Have you ever had to fight for your family or for yourself in a way you never expected? Please, share your story in the comments below. Your strength and your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to read today to feel a little less alone. Thank you for watching until the very end. If my story resonated with you, please give it a like and consider subscribing to the channel. You are the reason we continue to share these stories. Be well and be strong.